The house looked like it had been waiting for me to arrive. That's the first thing I remember. The way the late October light slanted across the driveway, painting the maple leaves in the front yard the color of bruises. My mother had insisted on setting the table in the formal dining room, dusting the silver and laying out the china with the kind of care she savored the way a surgeon savors control. I stood on the porch for a long time, my hands cold around the strap of my bag, listening to the muffled hum of conversation inside. The air smelled faintly of baked apples, and a cleaner that was too floral to be honest. I should have known then that something was different. The smiles through the window were too bright, the laughter too thin. My father, who could make a joke about a lost sock and have the whole room laughing, kept glancing at the entrance as if timing the moment I would step in. My brother Evan sat ramrod straight at the head of the table, his hair combed to the side like a man trying to look younger than he felt. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he'd rehearsed something, and was just waiting for the cue. The door swung open and the air changed. Stepping inside felt like walking into a photograph. Everything placed, everything posed. The chandelier above the table threw a warm, forgiving light over the china and the folded napkins, and my mother, hands trembling slightly, reached for me with an embrace that smelled of lily of the valley, perfume and an anxiety she couldn't hide. "Emily," she said, with the precise syllables of someone reading from a script that she'd practiced all day. "We're so glad you could come." I set my bag down in the hallway, felt the weight of the package I had brought for them. A small box of coffee beans from the roastery where I worked. Something to say thank you without saying anything about the small mortgage. I was still paying on the apartment I loved. They had taken my life and made it small with their eyes. Tonight they had taken my life and made it convenient. The centerpiece danced slightly in the little draft as the door closed behind me. We sat. For a while it was that peculiar, brittle politeness that comes when a family decides to be ceremonial about ordinary things. Conversation skimmed over weather, over my commute, over the trivial things Evan had done at work. Then my father cleared his throat and the room leaned in like a congregation waiting for hymns. "We think it's time we talked about the house," he said. His voice was even the kind of voice that fills a courtroom. "There are responsibilities that the family shares. I have kept my distance from the house for years. It was the house where I learned to make the perfect grilled cheese. Between my father's work shifts, where my mother taught me how to iron a collar until it snapped like a promise. It was the house Evan had always assumed would belong to him eventually. A relic in a small city like Madison, Wisconsin, passed from one generation to the next like a medal. I had watched that assumption become more than wishful thinking when Evan and my parents started whispering about repairs and property taxes and the way we should handle things. On the table, beneath the polished surface of the oak, were papers. At first I thought they were menus or perhaps notes for toasts. Then my mother slid them toward me with a smile that didn't meet her eyes. They were loan documents and a co-signature form, and something called a family equity agreement. My name was on each of them in the printed lines where signatures would go. "Our accountant drew it up," my father said. "It's only procedural, you're already on most of the accounts. But we thought it would be cleaner to consolidate everything." Evan across from me nodded, the movement tight. "We'll list you as co-signer for a small line of credit. It'll help with the renovation. You'll be protected. We can put it in a schedule so your responsibility is limited." I picked up the paper and felt the papery chill of the printed letters. "I didn't sign anything," I said, because that was the only honest sentence in the room. But their faces were already smoothed into the familiar lines of manipulation. Concern, disappointment, duty. "Emily," my mother said, the single word meant to bracket me with guilt. "Family helps family. You've always been good at taking care of people." It was my first taste of the strategy they had perfected for years. Turn devotion into obligation, goodwill into a legal instrument. They had always done this with smaller things, guilt about visiting less, hints about the way I didn't call enough, reminders that Evan had sacrificed so much for the family business. But that night their kind hands reached into my future and tried to rearrange it. I left with my bag heavier than when I'd come. Sleep came in fits and starts, and when I woke up the next morning my phone buzzed with a message from the human resources director at the roastery. Emily, can you verify your direct deposit? We had a discrepancy. My chest sank. I logged into my payroll portal and saw something that made the blood leave my face, an unauthorized attempted transfer that matched the amount Evan had said they would need within a week. Someone had checked my work records, my paycheck schedule, the little bonuses I'd worked for in overtime. The system showed an access log with a timestamp that coincided, suspiciously, with a long weekend when I'd been home, helping my mother with a leaking sink. I called Evan. He sounded surprised, but not incredulous. We're just trying to make sure we can move quickly, he said. You know how banks are? Paperwork takes time. But as the week unspooled, more breadcrumbs turned up. My company email had a forwarding rule I hadn't set. A benefits coordinator said someone had called pretending to be me, asking about my coverage and pushing for immediate changes. There were screenshots. Because sometimes people forget what they've done while they're arranging someone else's life, of a group text, a thread where my name flickered like a subject, and voices I recognized but didn't want to, my mother's voice typing, a third cousin's voice wanting to fix things before it's too late, Evan's voice saying, "She support us, she always does. We have to be a family." Finding the chat felt like opening a small, bright wound. The messages were clinical and cruel in their way. Operation House, one cousin labeled it, as if they were planning a harmless mission, and not the quiet strangulation of my financial autonomy. In the chat, they dissected me with the distance people have when they think of someone as a resource. There were lines about credit scores and the optics of having all signatures in place before the contractor sent the invoice. It read like the minutes of a meeting, where the person being discussed could not speak. My first instinct was rage. My second, guilty and stubborn, was to try to fix it within the family. I drove back to the house and knocked on the kitchen door. My mother answered as if she had been waiting for me, a gentle murmur on her lips, the scent of cinnamon in the air. "We didn't mean to scare you," she said. "We thought it would be easier if we handled it as a family." We sat at the kitchen counter and she poured coffee into a mug with both hands, the way she used to when I was a child and afraid of storms. She sounded small. "I just want what's best for you, Em," she said. And it was difficult not to fold at that one soft syllable. Yet the underlying logic was a trap. Her love came wrapped in financial strings. She spoke of the mortgage like a moral duty, about keeping traditions alive for Evan's children, about how we all pulled together felt like a hymn. There was no space in her argument for my own independence. The language of sacrifice became a tool used against me. My sacrifices had never been the family's to trade. When I tried to speak about the unauthorized access, she patted my hand and said, "It was only to check. You know how easy mistakes happen with paperwork. We're just looking out for you." The softness in her voice had the clarity of oil slicking the surface of truth. I left again, and as I walked to my car, the wind felt suddenly like someone passing a note. Cold and decisive. After that, their tactics escalated. It began with calls to my workplace from Evan's number with a practice concern. "Someone's messing with my sister's accounts," he said, voice carefully pitched. "We thought you might want to look into security." The HR director, who had always been kind, started asking me questions in a way that made everyone in the office look at me with thinly veiled pity. Then came the visits. Faces in the lobby, Evan glimpsed outside the building during my lunch break, my mother leaving handwritten notes addressed to me but delivered through a coworker. A woman from the church called my manager to talk about family unity, and what a disgrace it would be if our community saw a family falling apart. It had the cadence of a small town, of people who could marshal social pressure as easily as prayer bulletins. They weaponized reputation, faith, and the kindness of acquaintances to make me feel small and exposed. The church's pastor, a man with a low, soothing voice who'd baptized me at 12, brought a clipboard to the house and sat across from me in our living room as if he'd been dispatched on a delicate mission. "Sometimes families need to remind one another of their duties," he murmured, as if duties were something to be performed publicly and not felt privately. At work, during an afternoon of filling bags for a catered event, my manager, Jenna, pulled me aside. She had a practical stare and the habit of telling you what you needed to know before you asked for it. She said, "I know what's been happening. You don't have to deal with it alone." She told me about a role opening at the Seattle branch, a small team focused on quality control and communications. They need someone who knows the roastery the way you do, she said. It's a step up. Better benefits, less contact with family. If you wanted to start fresh. It was the hand I had hoped for but never expected. A professional lifeline offered with no strings. My heart leapt in a way that surprised me, not solely for the job, but for what a job could mean. A new city, new friends, new rules where my family's church bulletins and gossip couldn't follow me like a shadow. It was a promise that felt like oxygen. Planning the move was something I did in borrowed increments. I still showed up at the house when they called, but I began to pack in corners. I sent a few boxes to a storage unit, slipping in the small things that mattered, a stack of journals with the slant of my own handwriting, the chipped mug Evan had claimed as his from some earlier childhood mischief, the photos that didn't include the warm, staged smiles, but caught instead the half-second when someone's hand brushed another's, genuinely. I opened accounts, set up a P.O. box, made a list of what my new employer needed, references, tax forms, proof of address. I learned that starting over requires a surprising amount of bureaucracy, and that independence is often built out of paperwork and the quiet courage of repetitive tasks. I wrote a letter for my parents. Not confrontational, but honest, because I wanted to leave something that resembled an offering rather than a battlefield. I left it on the kitchen table under a saucer of stale mints. In it, I thanked them for the ways they had loved me and cataloged the ways. Their love had also been a ledger, balanced by other people's needs. I left a small sum in cash, not because I intended to pay their debts, but because I did not want my leaving to be a finality of anger. Small kindness, small mercy, my attempt at something civil. I didn't tell them where I was going. They found out anyway. The evening before my flight, my mother came to the apartment unannounced. She stood on my porch with the kind of expression that looked like rain. Soft but inexorable. She talked fast, as if explaining a crisis might hide the hurt. "You're making a mistake, Em. The family needs you. We can fix this without you going away." Her voice fractured between love and accusation. "Think of your grandparents. They wanted us together." "Grandpa left," I said, "because the truth sometimes sits raw and wants to be said. He ran away when I was 6. He said he couldn't take it anymore." The words stunned her. She had never spoken about his leaving except in hushed admonitions. The silence that followed was a small, honest thing between us. My brother's presence at the roastery that week had turned into deliberate escalation. He came during one of our busiest nights, arriving at the back door with a bouquet of procedural documents and a practiced, apologetic smile meant to disarm. The manager's polite curiosity evaporated. When he started accusing me in the staff kitchen, loudly, of being ungrateful and reckless, his voice carried in the thin walls as he cataloged my perceived failings. He played the martyr with such precision that even the barista who'd known me since I'd started as a student felt the tug of his story. They were rehearsed, synchronized. My mother called my workplace and asked about what hours I worked, about whether I was available for her on weekends. It was as if they were building a net, and at the center of that net was my sense of duty. In the end, the intervention they organized was a small, cruel parody of care. They gathered at our childhood table with the pastor and a scattering of relatives as witnesses. The pastor opened with a prayer about family bonds, and then my mother spoke about what a united family looked like. Evan read from a list of grievances like someone filing a case. It wasn't just about the house, though they had paper to show for that. It was about narrative control, telling a story where I was the one who betrayed the family by not volunteering my signature and surrender. They called their actions love. They called their plan an olive branch. They called my refusal rebellion. When my turn came to speak, I felt like someone who had learned to hold her breath until she could find a voice that wasn't guided by other people's expectations. I had prepared not for a speech, but for a simple sentence. "No," I said. The single syllable landed with more force than I'd intended. "I will not co-sign. I will not be your financial cushion. I will not sacrifice my future because you say it is our duty." The room convulsed. My father's face turned a color I'd seen only once before, when the roof collapsed in a storm, and he realized how fragile the house really was. My mother's hands trembled. The pastor, who had been smiling like a man watching a ballet, frowned. Emily, he said, like a man calling a stray dog back into the yard. We're only trying to protect what's ours. You're trying to own what's mine, I said. You already own my childhood, my cost of attendance bills, my apologies. But not my adulthood. The backlash was a thing of practiced severity. After the meeting, the calls multiplied, but now they had the tenor of punishment. My mother stopped visiting my apartment. My father's emails became sharp reminders about familial obligation. Evan sent me a message that read, in effect, like a promise to make me regret my decisions. You don't know how much this will cost you later. They began speaking about me like a disgraced member of a small town social ledger, marking me as unreliable and selfish. There were darker things as well. The anonymous notes, the childhood friends who were suddenly distant, the church bulletin that hinted at a moral failing without naming me directly. They used community as a cudgel. It is astonishing the way someone can recruit strangers into your private life when given a narrative they can place themselves within. The story of a daughter who refuses to do her duty. In the middle of all that pressure, the Seattle offer materialized into a real possibility. The hiring manager called me directly, and when I listened to his voice, something inside me unclenched. We'd love to have you start as soon as you can, he said. We can help with relocation. They asked practical questions and offered practical help. He said things like, you'll be with people who get the work. I clung to the phrase like a line thrown into the dark. I bought the plane ticket with my own fingers trembling over the keyboard. I didn't tell anyone except Jenna. She sat in the back office, leaning forward like a person who knows how to help someone cross a street safely. Take the night before to sleep, she said, pragmatic as always. Change your number on the day you leave, keep your bank accounts locked. If anything happens, call us. On the morning I left, the city still had that chill that bites just under your collarbone. I carried only what I could fit into a single suitcase and my overnight bag. In the taxi to the airport, while the city blurred past in a smear of early light and commuter coffee shops, I felt like a woman who had shed more than possessions. I had shed expectations that weighed like wet blankets. At the terminal, I sat at a gate and watched families move in clusters around me. Hubs of warmth and obligation. My throat tightened. On the plane, the engines droned and then rose, and with each degree of ascent, I felt the cords tighten in my chest soften. When the city fell away beneath a scattering of rooftops, when the world below reduced to a pattern of lights and roofs, I allowed a small, secret relief to unfurl. Seattle was as humid and alive as a living thing. The air smelled of salt and good coffee. My new apartment was a narrow place with a view of the city's islanding rooftops. Its slopes like a map drawn by someone with a taste for angles. The team at the roastery welcomed me with that professional warmth I had always loved, curious, practical, and without expectation. In the first days, I learned how to move without listening for my mother's voice in the pipes. I learned how to laugh without making room for someone else's approval. At night, I would lie awake and sift through the months of hurt like someone running their fingers along the ridged surface of coin. There were moments when the old life pressed against me in the shape of a text or a church member's sermon replayed on a recording, but they were like the echo of an old song. In the office, I found people who valued my meticulousness and my stubbornness. A woman named Kara took me under her wing. She had a bluntness that felt like truth. Your family will keep trying, she said once, handing me a mug. They'll call. They'll send things. You have to decide where your boundaries are and then hold them. I started to rebuild. The job was real work that rewarded diligence. I finally felt the slow, sturdier lines of a life being redrawn. I went to the grocery store and bought vegetables without first thinking whether anyone would approve. I set up my tax withholding and took out an insurance policy that made me feel grown-up in a way that wasn't punctuated by guilt. But freedom has its own grief. One night in November, after my first big paycheck, I walked to the waterfront and sat on the benches that looked out at the Sound, watching ferries go by like slow islands of light. I let the wind take the half-formed sentences I'd been saving for years. Apologies to myself for staying silent too long. The small thanks to myself for buying the ticket. I cried, not because I was broken, but because I had been mending in a place that finally gave my hands the space to do it. Months passed. The attempts to draw me back into their orbit dulled but did not disappear. My mother left messages that shifted between sadness and thin reprimand. Evan sent emails with a legal timbre, citing family obligations in a language that smelled like form letters. He'd attempted, once, to contact my supervisor with a complaint about the company's hiring practices, a small, spiteful thing meant to unsettle. The pastor stopped calling. The church's friendly faces grew distant on Facebook. The only people who consistently remained were those who had seen me as a person beyond the ledger. Jenna Cara, a co-worker named Miguel, who loved to debate the virtues of espresso. One afternoon, months after I'd left, I received a sealed envelope in the mail. It was small and unassuming, marked with my mother's familiar handwriting. I opened it with a cautious hand. Inside was a note, a simple sentence and a photo. The note read, "Forgive me." The photo was of our old kitchen table, sunlit and empty, with a small vase of tulips in the center. I didn't know if it was an admission or an act of performative contrition. I folded it and kept it in the back of my desk drawer anyway. Like someone keeping a strip of old wallpaper that reminds them of the colors they once knew. Forgiveness is a strange thing you sometimes give yourself through the hands of others. The day came, as days do, when the past had lost its capacity to command me. I'd learned how to say no without apologies. And in the places I had formerly stumbled, I found a steadying rhythm. I called my father once, impulsively, and spoke to him as a woman speaks, when she is no longer borrowing courage from the people who trained her to be timid. He answered with the same voice he'd used at the dinner table, but this time it faltered. We talked about mundane things. The heater in his car, the neighbor's dog, Evan's promotion that had nothing to do with me. He did not ask me to sign anything. I didn't offer. The finality I had once feared now looked like a clear, narrow lane. It was not that I had cut the family from my life as a dramatic severance. Rather, I had tightened the borderline so they could no longer flood me. I saw them sometimes, as if through glass, their gestures, their small betrayals, and their moments of genuine love. People are rarely only one thing. My parents had loved me in 1,000 ways, even as they had learned to wield love as leverage. They had been wounded by their own histories, by poverty and pride and all the stories inherited with names. Evan had been both my torment and my younger brother, who once held my hand crossing a street. A messy constellation. In the small theater of my new life, I stood at the edge and watched myself form. I got a cat, a small creature named Mizo, who demanded breakfast at 6 a.m. and fit couches like a puzzle piece. I learned to cook a roast that did not remind me of any childhood argument. I found a community that loved coffee as much as it loved its people. And in that community, I discovered that care could be precise without being possessive. Occasionally, when the night was quiet and the moon sat high over the city, I would think of the house in Madison. I imagined my parents at the table, the pastor's clipboard tucked away, Evan pacing in the yard. I imagined them older, perhaps softened, perhaps still bound by their assumptions. In those imaginings, I felt no rancor that demanded retribution. I felt the steady, stubborn thing that had carried me out of the house in the first place. The right to shape my life without being flattened into the contours of someone else's plans. The last time I went back, which was once, unannounced, on an autumn afternoon when the light felt like a hand on my shoulder, I took no documents with me. I wore a sweater Evan had once made fun of and carried a loaf of bread from a bakery in Capitol Hill. My mother opened the door, and for the first time, she did not try to guilt me or persuade me. She simply let me in. We sat at the table where once the formalities had been laid out like talismans. There was no churchman waiting with a clipboard. There was no cousin with a label for every person. There was only the small, inevitable conversation two adults can have when they have finally had the space to be honest. We spoke about little things first, and then, because the way our lives had been coiled demanded it, about what had happened. My mother did not offer a grand apology. Why would she? Apologies are learned as easily as offenses. She said instead, I was trying to keep us together. There was an ache to the words, not an excuse, but an admission. I told her what it had been like to be used as a bank guarantee. I told her how it felt to have my life itemized by people who loved me. She listened the way people listen when they are ready to be changed, not when they are waiting for their cue. There were tears, and there were small confessions about things from before I was born, about fear and missteps and the way a church can sometimes praise conformity over compassion. When I left that day, the light on the porch was soft and merciful. I did not expect miracles. I had not come to fix anything or to undo the past. I came to mark an ending that was not a final burning but a deliberate cooling down. The act of choosing myself without malice toward the people who had not known how to be anything but themselves. I went back to Seattle after that, to the little, narrow apartment with the city's hum outside the window. I unpacked the bread slowly. The city had a way of keeping its promises. The roastery shift lights, the laughter of coworkers, the slow, honest accumulation of small victories. There are mornings when I still wake with a ghost of the old fear, the fear of being claimed, of being made into someone else's ledger. But I have learned to move through this life with a new set of rules, boundaries carved like careful lines, patience for the long, hard work of rebuilding trust, and an unflinching care for the small, steady things that make up a life. On the plane that first took me away, I had looked down at the map and thought of all the ways a person could be measured, by land, by debt, by vows. I had chosen to redraw the measure by which I would be known. The final decision to cut loose was not the closing of a door as much as the opening of a window. Years from now, I imagine a life made of deliberate choices. It will have losses and tenderness, defeats and a stubborn joy. It will be full of coffee that I pour for myself and for friends who knew me before and after. And sometimes when the evening is very still and the fairies hum like a slow hymn, I will think of the house in Madison and the people who live there, and my heart will be roomy and free and, finally, entirely mine.